I first of all want to welcome everyone to this early stage innovation panel. We have a very nice setup of panelists from a variety of areas of expertise, not to mention the roles that they play in their individual everyday lives. So to begin this panel, I would like to first introduce everyone, and I'm going to ask each of the panelists to introduce themselves, but more importantly, to take a little bit of time and talk about their precise role, if possible, in the context of early stage investment. So let's start with Anton, please.
Yes, hello. Can everyone hear me? Great, thank you. So my name is Anton Xavier. I'm the director of Silicon Valley Bank Life Sciences in the Northeast. I have a large pharma background at Pfizer, where I was involved in R&D prior to Silicon Valley Bank, involved in research and discovery all the way to clin dev for immuno-oncology assets, as well as antibody drug conjugates. Also involved in strategic partnerships and external innovation, bringing in new deals that were strategically aligned in immuno-oncology. I then moved to an accelerator and then moved to Silicon Valley Bank. My specific role at Silicon Valley Bank is more on the non-banking side. I support our early stage startup banking portfolio of companies in the life science sector across all verticals. That's biopharma, digital health, et cetera, and ensure that they reach the next inflection point in their growth, whether that's corporate growth or R&D growth. Since they are early stage, most of that growth is actually focused on R&D. And so what we focus on is ensuring that they have the right data package in hand, that they're introduced to the right investors, what that investor syndicate would look like for the stage they are particularly at. We focus on companies that have just been incorporated all the way up to the big institutional Series A. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much, Anton. Next, Kate, can you please introduce yourself?
Sure. Hello. My name is Kate Strayer-Benton, and I lead business development for the Innovation Office at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. Innovation at Dana-Farber encompasses all of the tech transfer functions of the Institute, and I am focused on building out a team that is really focused on enhancing our current business development efforts, optimizing our existing strategic collaborations, identifying new collaboration opportunities with biopharma and investors, and developing novel funding strategies for the incredible work that we have coming out of the labs at Dana-Farber. I thought I could highlight a couple of from the last couple of years, which include countless sponsored research and co-development collaborations. But Dana-Farber has also spun out a dozen startups. We've launched an internal accelerator fund, and our first ever venture fund, Binney Street Capital, was just launched this year. We've also forged a unique venture philanthropy collaboration with MPM Capital, and recently announced our second major collaboration with Deerfield Management. Following the establishment of our Center for Protein Degradation in 2018, we've created Riverway Discoveries, which we launched earlier this year. And hopefully I'll have a chance to talk a little bit about some of those later in the panel. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you very much, Kate. Really exciting to see what's happening at Dana-Farber, and really look forward to digging deeper into some of the initiatives that you just mentioned and the new models that you're pursuing. So it's fitting in that vein to actually have Meredith introduce herself next. Also comes with an academic background and initiatives.
Yeah, terrific. Thanks, Kuldeep. So my name is Meredith Fisher. I'm a partner at Mass General Brigham Ventures. We are the venture arm of Mass General Brigham, as our name suggests. For those of you who may not be familiar with that as a system and as a research basis, we're the largest group of academic medical research hospitals affiliated with Harvard Medical School, comprising about 7,000 researchers and about $2 billion of funding on an annualized basis. The fund, which now covers close to about $500 million of assets under management, invests in companies that are spun out of our system and have IP or discoveries that are used as sort of the foundational basis for those company creations. And in the role that I sit in, my sort of day job largely, of course, is as a venture investor, but given where I sit sort of inside of a system, we actually end up playing a lot of operational roles early on as we sort of end up looking at programs, even from their inception, maybe from a first IP filing, et cetera, to help them sort of guide them all the way through that translational data package development out into our portfolio companies. The portfolio right now, I believe of 35 companies. Many of those are still active. And I take actually both investor seat by way of we make investments into companies, sit on boards as sort of a traditional venture fund, but because we also originate companies ourselves and will fund those, I also will sometimes take operational roles. So for instance, while my day job as an investor, I also sit as the interim CEO of one of the companies that I co-founded with three founders from within our system, and have done so for the last couple of years doing that. So it's a little bit of a split between sort of that pure investor hat, as well as also that entrepreneur and executive hat.
Great, thank you, Meredith. And I would like to hear more as we discuss how you go about doing that dual role. Thanks. So Ryan, next, please. Thanks.
Sure. So I'm Ryan Scholtfeld. I'm the Chief Scientific Officer of the Mark Foundation for Cancer Research. So the Mark Foundation it's still a relatively new cancer research nonprofit. It's been around for about 3.5 years. Most of our effort goes into giving grants. We've given out about $125 million in cancer research focused grants in the last 3.5 years. And the team that I lead, we do the kind of opportunity scouting, sourcing, and we work with our advisory committees to make funding decisions and to shape projects and to kind of identify scientific areas of focus within cancer research that we think are important. Obviously, immuno-oncology comes into a lot of this in different ways. We have a really substantial interest in therapeutics. So, we focus on mainly academic research. We fund a lot of research that has a therapeutics discovery, and we also do diagnostics discovery, but therapeutics as well, things that are going to advance towards really impacting the patients directly in the clinic. And so we'll give grants to kind of let grantees kind of help them across the cliche but real valley of death, where the biological discoveries really need a little more de-risking before they're ready to go out there and license out or spin out, and even if those sometimes are options, sometimes that's it's too early. Sometimes it makes sense to stick with the academic setting where the biology was first pioneered and discovered a little bit longer. So we'll encourage that. One thing that my team also does is we work with our investment arm. So we have the Mark Foundation has a venture investment component. We do venture philanthropy. We'll invest in early stage companies that align with our mission for cancer research. And we specifically help out when our grantees are moving into the commercialization stage with projects that are coming out from grants that we funded. We will provide seed funding. We'll also provide helpful, access to advisors to help them structure things on the business side or the clinical development side. And we really just try to be helpful in that ecosystem to really help discoveries move into commercialization and reach patients. And we also, we don't limit our investing to projects that came out of our grants. We'll invest in any cancer research focused venture is in scope for us. So my team also does the scientific due diligence for those opportunities.
Great. Thank you very, very much, Ryan. Very interesting. Would love to hear more about your investments and what's in scope. And it's interesting to hear that it's not focused entirely on what comes out of the Mark Foundation. Thank you very much, Ryan. Next, Alicia Stillman, please. And I just wanted to let the audience know that unfortunately, Sonia Gulati could not make it for personal reasons. And we're very grateful, Alicia, that you have stepped in.
Of course, it's my pleasure. I'm Althea Stillman, and I work for the IP Group, which is an early stage investment firm. And it sounds like somewhat similar to Meredith's role. We spend a lot of time doing due diligence and working solely with our academic partners. So we provide our own pipeline with our academic institutions that we have a high touch model with. So we keep our partnership fairly small because there's so much that happens within some of these premier institutions. And we actually are technology agnostic. So we have a physical sciences team alongside of a life sciences team. So it's a nice problem to have when you can look at everything underneath the sun. But obviously cancer is a main area of interest for us as well. And so my role is basically to do technology scouting, due diligence, often setting up the business development plan. We'll put in some initial seed funding to de-risk the technology further, start to build out the commercial plan and see if anyone is interested to begin with is a primary concern, but also really start to build out the team, and then we'll put more capital behind it. So we expect a little bit longer runway. Obviously, we're starting from new co-formation often, so it takes a little bit longer, but we expect to be very much in that sort of Series A sweet spot, especially in biotech. So it's a really exciting opportunity, and often I'm hands-on doing the operational role as well until we have a little bit more traction and more team behind it.
Great, thanks a lot. Thanks, everyone. So I will certainly co-moderate this panel, and my name is Kuldeep Neote, and I am in the Venture Sciences group at Eli Lilly. And a little bit different from some of the other major pharmas, Lilly has put together what we're calling a Lilly New Ventures initiative. And what we specifically do is we've taken up an LP position in a fairly large number of venture funds. Today, we have well over 15 LP positions in funds. And what it does is that it gives us, an insight and a view of the portfolio of our venture partners. And you can imagine that this portfolio inevitably has a number of very, very early stage, recently created ventures that in many ways are in stealth mode. And this allows us with an opportunity to really interact with these newly formed ventures and determine if there are any strategic fits with Eli Lilly where we can explore partnerships and collaborations. As you can imagine, by nature, these kinds of ventures are very, very early stage. A lot of them are very recent spin-outs from academia. And we get the opportunity to interact with those ventures and really help shape sometimes or bring our capabilities that could be even a growth inflection, pre-seed or at the seed investment stage. So a very interesting approach, and I look forward to talking about some of our initiatives in this panel. So with that, I'll turn it over to my co-moderator, Michal, and Michal, you'll start the panel discussion.
Yeah, thank you. So Michal Preminger here. I head Johnson & Johnson Innovation in East North America. Johnson & Johnson Innovation serves Johnson & Johnson's early external innovation partnering by offering partners in academia, in the seed stage and startup stage, and a broad proposition that includes anything from incubation to funding to research collaborations, a lot of mentoring and bringing, as Kuldeep also mentioned, bringing the big company capabilities, expertise, and commercial outlets to serve, shape, invest, accelerate early innovation all the way from the lab toward development. So really delighted to be here. And I think the audience, it's easy to recognize that each of the panelists here sits in a very unique position, seeing a tremendous breadth of innovation that is emerging from labs and from early stage companies. And so we thought that maybe we can kick off the discussion with a speed round in which we will ask each of the panelists to highlight a few exciting new areas that are relevant for IO and that are coming in the field. And there is this question that sometimes people ask, I mean, is this field maturing, or are we still seeing a flow and maybe a flood of next generation and other transformational science that is bound to keep the evolution of this field, very dynamic and promising. So maybe we'll go in reverse order this time. So Althea, we'll start with you.
Sure. I think one of the things that I've spent a lot of time recently seeing and focused on is actually bioinformatics. Really understanding better patient stratification is a key component. Responders, non-responders, complete response. We're seeing a lot of really interesting new ideas around how better to assay for that. And I think that that's giving some better indications of how to precisely target different types of cancer. And then what type of modality you would need for that. And then obviously, the modular and bispecific approaches, how do you start to really hone in on what to target in a more precise manner, also goes hand in hand with that.
Thank you so much, Althea. I think Ryan is next.
Okay, so but sorry, just to repeat the question. This is what what's new that I'm excited.
Yeah, what's new in this science and technology that.
Sure. I mean, so there's a lot of things. One I'll highlight two areas. So one that's more diagnostic is in the I really see substantial increases in the early detection and the minimal residual disease detection spaces now. It's been happening for a while, right? Liquid biopsy has been, there's been it's been a venture. It's been a growth area in the venture stages since, for the last 5 to 10 years. But I think it's really coming to an exciting moment now where there's a lot of clinical implementation of these technologies that holds the potential to really change the way we treat patients, to make funding, to make de-escalation decisions for patients or therapy switching decisions. And so I'm really excited about clinical trials and clinical studies that are happening now that are linked to these technologies. In the liquid biopsy space, many of these technologies, kind of a nice combination of wet lab technologies that have evolved in terms of sampling, as well as machine learning, artificial intelligence-based and cloud technology-based solutions that really marry together and have brought us to this position where we are. We're really seeing we're poised to see patient trajectories really be positively impacted by these technologies that have come out. And then the other, in the therapeutic side, really excited to see the, certain platforms, for example, in chemically induced proximity, right? As a platform, as a concept, there's platforms like this, technologies that have evolved now into platforms that are really giving us clinical candidates and clinical candidates in ways, in new companies that are popping up. It started with degradation, right? It started with PROTACs and IMiDs and things that are used for protein. That field's blossoming. But you see now the kind of next extension of that happening, where just using small molecules to bring proteins together is really poised to kind of change the way we look at targets and the way we look at drug discovery in a very meaningful way, and really expand the kind of therapeutic. It's like, even though they're technically still small molecules, it's really like its own therapeutic modality. Small molecules that bring proteins together to impact their function in new ways. And so I'm really excited about technologies I see there.
Hey, thank you so much, Ryan. Go to Meredith, I think. I hope I'm keeping the order right.
I'm happy to go. So I would say one of the things that we've seen more recently in our research space is not necessarily moving away from the T cell, but moving away from the T cell in methodology, technology, and biology that still brings you back to the T cell, because I think that there's sort of still a feeling that those are sort of the most universal for sort of super charged horsepower, but other approaches that leverage, let's say, the innate immune system that actually feeds into the adaptive immune system, and thinking about how to actually supercharge that to sort of get to that instead of going directly at the T cell itself. And I think what also ties into that then is also the focus around sort of in the tumor microenvironment, and interestingly, back to immune cells in that phenotypic switching that we're seeing, and sort of understanding an M1, M2, an N1, N2 as well. And so those sort of not just populations of immune cells, but the phenotype that they're displaying has also been a really interesting area for us. I could probably list 4 or 5 more, but we've got other terrific experts here, so I'll defer to my co-panelists to see if there's other areas that they're excited about.
Thank you, Meredith. And we'll go to Kate, coming from Dana-Farber, focused on cancer. That must be very exciting.
I know it's hard to think of just one example. I think there's so many out there, and actually, you know, I jotted down some notes for myself in advance, and already, you know, Ryan and Meredith hit on some of the ones that I wanted to talk about. You know, I think I wanted to piggyback briefly on something Ryan talked about in terms of the value of machine learning and advancements in the diagnostic space. That was, I think, one of the trends that I wanted to highlight today in terms of the increased emphasis that we're seeing on the value of AI and ML as they apply to just interpreting the vast amounts of data coming out of technologies, you know, especially in like the immune profiling and tumor microenvironment, as Meredith highlighted as well. If you just think of the sheer scale of that data that's coming out from these techniques, like single cell omics and others, you really need the advances in AI and ML to fully interpret, I think, and apply the learnings. And so I think it's really exciting to see where, you know, those wet labs to the more bioinformatics spaces are starting to merge, and some of the advancements that are coming from that. I think, you know, other things that we're seeing is there's still, you know, considerable emphasis on cell therapy, but you're seeing an increasing focus on NK cells, on macrophages, gamma T cells, and other cell types. We're also seeing an emphasis on off-the-shelf cell therapies. And really there, I think, you know, you're getting a lot of attention on the next generation of cell therapies, because anything we can do to overcome the manufacturing and logistical challenges associated with autologous CAR T cells, I think are really exciting. And just, I think I've mentioned NK cells probably a couple of times already, but, you know, NK cell biology is just hot for a number of reasons right now. And we're really witnessing an increased interest in NK-mediated checkpoint targets, NK cells, NK CARs. You know, there's just a lot going on in that space with the evolution of that biology. And I don't know if you're going to save it for a second question, or if, you know, I think you mentioned in the beginning, you know, the maturation that we're seeing, and, you know, happy to address that as well, because that was actually a question I chatted with some colleagues this morning about in anticipation of this panel. And I think it's a really interesting question to ask, because they're mixed views. I think part of it depends on, you know, people say, well, how are you defining maturing? And I think that the combination focus of the field in IO is one sign of maturation, but specific to the investment world, I think another sign that we're really seeing here is the investment shift from what's feasible, like asking the questions, can we do this, to questions of differentiation among our early stage investors. And if you look and think about the IO market as having matured in the level of competition that we're seeing now, it's become even more important with that heightened competition for investors, even at early stages, to understand differentiation. So in that sense, I think the bar, you know, is higher now, and that's a sign of the maturation of the field, in that, you know, seed investments, there's higher standards than we've seen in the past.
So great, thank you, Kate. So I think what you're saying, I mean, I think what you say about the field is resonating, and yet I think we are up for a new wave or multiple new waves of disruption and transformation coming from the labs that you are all you're all kind of scanning and enabling and mobilizing. So that's great.
And that's where it gets back to the question of how do you define maturing?
Yeah, no, actually, the reason we put the word maturation is to evoke a conversation, because because it could be interpreted in different ways, and so that's a good conversation starter. But we'll get back to that and how this impacts partnering later. I just want to give an opportunity to Anton to share some of your observations from the field.
Yeah, thank you. So coming from SVB Bank, we are also agnostic. We'll bring in any oncology companies that we think have a good opportunity to grow at that early stage. The downside of going last in this particular discussion is that most of the major topics have been covered, but humor me, if you will. I could be boring, and I'm just gonna riff on this. I could be boring and say that next generation therapeutics are going to be the ones that are maturing right now. So next generation bispecific CD3 engagers, where you're going to have a multifunctional or multi-specific approach, where you're going to get more durability to your CD3 cells. Maybe having a CD28 on there to prevent any anergy. That's a possibility. Allogeneic T cells, allogeneic NK cells, that's been mentioned before. That's essentially taking it off the shelf. Targeting the immunosuppressive environment, M2, M1 macrophages, changing a tumor microenvironment to a more pro-inflammatory Th1 state is the boring stuff. I would say is where everyone is leaning. I would like to take it in a different angle, and what I've been seeing internally and with discussions with some of our ventures and some of the ecosystem is a potential area that we could go in that could cross into multiple therapeutic areas, and that's aging and particularly targeting senescence. If we look at T cells, three dysfunctions of T cells being anergy, exhaustion, and senescence. Anergy is a pretty much hosed approach. If you reach an anergic T cell, the only way you're going to get out of that potentially a RAS activation or something like that. But if you're looking at exhaustion, you've got your checkpoint inhibitors. For senescence, which is predominantly where you see with aging population, how you're going to target that, and the secretory associated phenotype that goes with that, SASP, and how that could impact not only immunosenescence, but how that impacts the cancer tumor microenvironment as well. So I'm seeing a few companies that are starting to grow in this space of aging, and certainly it is an incredibly important space, not only for a durable response for an immune system attack on tumor cells, but also could be crossed over into tumor vaccines for the elderly, but also vaccines as a whole. And as you can see, we're in a pandemic right now. Elderly population would have a large population of senescent cells and may not necessarily respond to vaccines as well. So that is an area I would say is emerging. It's not at the maturation stage, but it is getting to a point where I'm starting to see some exciting science in there that we would be looking at more seriously.
Thank you, Anton. I think that patients would actually be very pleased if all the boring stuff pans out. But it's exciting to hear about other things. Just before handing back to Kuldeep, I'll just mention, as someone who works across sectors, that an interesting trend that we see is using energy to basically in combination with drugs to elicit a stronger response, and it's an emerging field with a lot of interesting development that probably we'll hear more about. So back to you, Kuldeep.
Great, thanks. Very, very interesting discussion. I do want to actually just go back to a couple of points that a number of you made, and really, if you will, Michal, take a deeper dive on this. And there's two things that resonated with me. I think one really was, I think, Althea, you mentioned that the amount of data that's being generated. I think even Kate, you mentioned this, right? Is going to be overwhelming. You go back to single cell sequence data that is coming out, and you multiply that with the heterogeneity that you see in different cancer types, and how you interpret that data. You mentioned AI and machine learning are going to be key here, but there's a step before that, and the step before that is actually data analytics. How do you analyze the data, which then is poised to look for trends, to look for patterns that are amenable to AI and machine learning. Let me put this in context with what Ryan, you said, that liquid biopsies and diagnosis to stratify patients is getting much more refined now. With the type of amounts of volumes of data that we're seeing, the heterogeneity, we're getting a better feel for. And as a point of example, just in 2020, there were 10 diagnostic tests that were approved, for cancer. And these really were to really look at what the addiction pathways are, what the oncogenes, tumor suppressor genes are, so that you can really hone into that subset of patients that you want to treat with targeted therapeutics. My question to you, the panelists, especially from Dana-Farber and MGS, is how is the academic world adapting to this new world of single cell seq data analytics, making it public? Because I can't imagine how that is going to be shared to benefit the patient, number one. Number two, that not being redundant in the tools that are being developed to analyze these data and the algorithms that are being really put together to look at the data in different ways. How is the academic world doing this and translating it? Sorry, I think I'm throwing a lot here.
Kate, do you want to go first, and I'll follow?
I'll try to start. I think you asked a lot of questions there, and I think you asked a lot of good questions, and a lot of questions we don't have answers for yet. And I think the world of, I'll speak to the comment just on the huge volumes of data and the analysis required and all the technologies and companies that are emerging in the field to help with that it creates a lot of opportunity, but it also creates a lot of challenges that hadn't been anticipated before. And how do you think about what data is shared and when, for what purposes? And a lot of these companies, especially in the AI and the ML space, right, they want to help you with analytics because they want to train their systems. And at Dana-Farber, we don't sell our data. That's a promise we've made to our patients. And so, we will collaborate around research that involves data and appropriately consented and all of that, but we're not going to, put our data out there for the benefit of someone else's technology if there isn't a true sort of research collaboration in place there. And so that creates a lot of interesting conversations. And I think, we've had to pass up some great opportunities for collaboration because it felt like there was a profiting on our patients that just didn't sit right with us. However, there's a lot of other collaborations that we have and continue to explore that really take advantage of the fact that a place like Dana-Farber, just our patient volumes are, and patient volumes in common cancers, but also in many rare cases, are such that we do have an incredibly valuable asset in the data that we have and in the data we continue to collect. And Dana-Farber has been on the forefront in immune profiling and other techniques in offering it to our patients. And so we've made a commitment internally to some of these technologies in terms of what we'll provide for our patients. And then we've also, are continuing to look at ways to expand. So I know that's a bit of a vague answer to a really big question and a lot of sub questions there, but hopefully it gives you a sense of where we're going.
Great, thanks. Yeah, absolutely. Meredith and Ryan, do you want to go next and provide your insights? Who wants to go next?
Go ahead, Ryan.
Okay, sure. I'll go ahead. So I'll speak from the perspective of our grant making perspective, because you can imagine that a lot of, we see a lot of proposals asking for funding where the most substantial component of the budget is towards single cell analysis and sequencing at scale, because it's very expensive, right, to do this across even a few samples, let alone, you know, to power. It's a really interesting challenge just from that perspective alone, because in one sense, if you're going to go in for this kind of work, you want to see that ultimately the questions, the important questions, are appropriately powered, that you can answer a question, but also then you're talking about scale sometimes in terms of numbers, let alone what you can do with the data afterwards. You know, it's so just generating and manipulating and paying for all these analyses it gets to be quite substantial. So that's our conundrum when we think about funding research like that at scale to do this kind to generate these kinds of data. You know, we think about it from the perspective of, you know, making a database that others will use is great, but we tend to not do it just for that reason, because honestly, we think patients, you know, if you tell a cancer patient we funded a database, I don't think that they really care, right? I mean, they might care if they really understand the research they'll get used for, but we really want to answer questions and test hypotheses and develop new diagnostics and new therapeutics. And so we always look at what's that data going to be used, in service of what question is that data coming? So that's one angle. The other angle that we look at this from is, you know, through our foundation, let alone what's going out there in the realm of cancer research funding more broadly, so much data is getting generated. You know, as much as I just said right now that I don't think patients care that we make a database, they still think it's a missed opportunity. All the data that does get generated gets left behind sometimes just because it's a really substantial effort to go in and clean that data. Kuldeep, as you said, before you do the machine learning, you know, 80% of the time is spent just organizing and cleaning the data, and let alone going through that. If you're going to collaborate, the data transfer agreements and things like that can be substantial in terms of their time commitment. So, you know, how do we find that balance between, you know, what it takes to share and use and reuse data for interesting questions, and, you know, paying for generating large amounts of single cell data at scale to answer, you know, a primary question that we're suited for. We're still, it's an ongoing conversation in our world to like think about how we're approaching this, and it's changing quickly as technologies evolve and as the questions, new questions arise.
Great. No, great. Thanks, Ryan. And before we move to Meredith, I do want to introduce another element of the discussion that would love to get everyone's perspective, is really, discuss how these types of, investments or capitalization you're doing in big data, how has that changed over the last year? And in other words, we've seen unprecedented amount of capital in the market, right? Even though it was a pandemic year, we've had almost a 20% influx of capital, and the capital is coming at every stage of the growth of a company, all the way from Series A, Series B to IPO. When we think about these kinds of new areas that you need to make investments, it'll be great, Meredith, and then maybe Alicia, to ask you, how has the influx of capital influenced where investments are made? Maybe Meredith, you can start.
Yeah, so I'll pick up a little bit on Kate and Ryan's points, and then I'll maybe transition over there if I can keep that thought going directly. But yeah. I think, in short, it may not be surprising if I put just my Mass General Brigham hat on, take my investor hat off, to say that we face the same challenges and the same thought processes that Kate and Ryan do around patient data access. What do you do with those samples, and who and how do you partner with? What I think the next step for us then that we see with our PIs is if even within our system, they can only get access to a small number of patient data samples just because there just aren't that many, or it would be easier for us to there's more out there, but just not within our system at scale. We see them frankly pivoting over to a place where they can get a lot of samples, which is in vivo models. And the challenge for us, if I put my investor hat back on, is that fundamentally, I am so incredibly skeptical of those models, as well as also the diverse way that those data are collected and the quality of those data, it's very hard for me then when I put my investor hat back on to get that excited about them. So if we go then to how do I think about it from an investment standpoint, from my perspective, it's very challenging for me to think about that as an investor, because I think fundamentally the scale that we would need, the data cleanup and quality of data, the sample sets that we will need are outside of the realm, at least for me as an early stage venture investor, that I can imagine collecting capital to do successfully. And so I actually would put it back over to my MGB hat and my colleagues who sit within their own system, in that something that is consortia driven, although it can be long, take a long time, be a real pain in some ways, actually I think could allow for public disclosure and all the other pieces that we want to have, that then I think other folks can come in and layer over their own AI, ML, and learning to get to and compete on their ability to extract and exploit those data. But I think collectively we need to generate them. Skipping then, Kuldeep, just quickly, and I'll turn it over to Althea next, I think, to pick up on sort of the additional capital in the marketplace. We are definitely seeing so much more capital. But I have to say, one observation that I have made is that what we're not necessarily seeing is more companies being funded. We're seeing an individual company taking on more capital than they would have normally. And so, for instance, one of my partners sent around a joke the other day, which I'm going to steal from him, and I'm sure he stole from somebody else, which is just like, we're seeing seeds that used to be five millions. Now, a company that I'm interim CEO, our seed is a $20 million seed. And so we've started calling them mango seeds, just given the size of them. And so what I'd say is, yes, we're seeing more capital in the marketplace, but the distribution of that capital, I don't think is as broad as I personally might like it. And so we're just seeing more companies that are just raising more money on a round by round basis. And I'll turn it over to Althea to either agree with me or disagree if she's seeing other things with her portfolio.
Maybe I'll just inject a question about this that Althea can also address. Does this translate to higher acceleration eventually because we have more money for each company, or does it also allow for bigger ideas or more ideas to be put into those well-funded companies, and so the net kind of number of ideas would be the same? I'm just curious. I don't know, Meredith, if you want to quickly answer, or we can go to Althea.
I'll let Althea take this one, and I'll chime in if possible.
No, I completely agree with you, Meredith. I think that I think you need to have more substance now. I think there was a phase where it felt like people were willing to throw money at just ideas, and now I think that there's a little bit more substance, but it is more of a uneven type of financing. I would argue, especially coming from my type of model, I do like to stress test a little bit more. And so sometimes I think it does help to have a whole bolus of a mango seed to help accelerate something. But I think also sometimes if you don't have the right management stewardship in place, it doesn't allow for a little bit of, kicking the tires and making sure that it's the right idea to advance. And so then these become quite large and hard to manage from an investor base, and it's a little bit of a too big to fail so quickly kind of scenario. So it does concern me at times that when you see financing for a company that probably should have had a little bit more time on their clock, that's kind of what I'm seeing.
That's interesting. I would like to get Anton your view with this excess capital and maybe different evolving models of investment. What are you seeing from an SVB perspective?
Oh yeah, so we're seeing so we do have we will have a VC unit online with SVB Bank by the end of the year, run by two ex-Pfizer venture capital colleagues, and we'll be looking to invest equity dollars into life science companies. The benefit of that is my former role at Pfizer, I get to speak to them and see what they're seeing and what their thoughts are. But just before I touch upon that and what's happening in this frothy or bubble market, whatever you want to call it. I did want to touch upon the omics revolution and this buzzwords of AI and ML. If I hear that again, I'll fall asleep, because it is really being thrown around by everyone, and no one really knows how to do it properly. One caution I would put out to that is AI and ML. The issues with that, and from what data I've been generated in the past in my previous roles, is that you have to be wary of the usual suspects, because they always show up as targets. And what are the novel suspects, and how are you going to validate those, and how much data you're going to put into a data package for all of those others, and what are the most relevant ones, and that's going to be of critical need, and it's going to be a deployment of capital. And that's a good way to segue into deployment of capital, right? So crossover funds moving into Series A moving into seed stage, people moving earlier and earlier. The deal sizes and the number of deals in 2020 have been huge, record breaking. Q1 2021, same thing. Oncology leads the way. Second to secondary would be platform, tertiary would be neurology. Oncology, again, leading would be immuno-oncology. SVB does a lot of the scrape on internal as well as external data, and has been showing that. The worry is over-capitalization that's not tied to scientific milestones, and that's what we're seeing a lot of, right? So, and another worry is the other funding models in play, right? So let's say a venture studio or a venture capital backed company, and a CEO of a very early stage company wanting to do it himself or herself, and being approached by a venture studio saying, hey, look, here's 10 million. Here's a Rolodeck of management that we could put into this company. We're going to move you from CEO to CSO or CTO role, but you got the upside of this potentially going IPO in 2 years. We have deep pockets. We'll push it forward. Really nothing in there, nothing tangible in there, because it's still not tied to milestones. And the worry is that historically, pharma used to drive what was interesting, right? Pharma would say that, we're looking in this area, and then companies would form around that area with the thought that they would get an M&A deal with pharma, right? But now you're getting these IPO, these short lifespan companies, and they're going IPO through SPACs or something. They don't really care what pharma's strategic interests are. They're just doing these kinds of rounds, and there's no real scientific milestone attachment to it. So is it a fluffy market? Is it a bubble? It's very challenging, but it is a good time for companies to raise money with data that is considered hot by not necessarily strategic partners, and who's driving those decisions would be, the predominantly venture studios and KOLs, which may not necessarily always be right. They may not necessarily have the deep expertise of large pharma as to the failings of parallel therapies or therapies in that exact same space.
Absolutely, Anton, being very, very cautious here what this extra capital would do. So anyway, Michal, I will turn it over to you.
Yeah,
I appreciate we're running out of time.
Yeah, this was great segue maybe to a final speed round, around partnering. So in the early stage. So I think Anton gave us a very good overview, but I'm curious to hear how others are experiencing partnering, new models, same old. How are things looking from your vantage point? Maybe we'll go back to Kate, who has been taking a break for a while.
Sure, resting up for this one. Well, I think I mentioned earlier our relationship with Deerfield, so it's not exactly related to the trends that Anton was describing, but Many of you may be aware that in 2018, Dana-Farber launched the Center for Protein Degradation through an $80 million commitment from in partnership with Deerfield. And a recent success of that CPD relationship was the launch of Neomorph and a $100 million plus raise, Series A raise last year. So given that success that we had with CPD and Neomorph, we created a second partnership with Deerfield, which is actually the first time they've ever done a second partnership with an academic, one of their academic partners. And it's called Riverway Discoveries. And it represents a major translational research partnership that's going to fund projects beyond degraders and including stuff in IO. And we're excited about it because it's bringing drug development and company formation expertise earlier into this partnership. So there's still going to be sponsored research funding and an ability to advance things through that valley of death, but really with an eye on startup formation and doing those really critical de-risking and important drug development steps to advance these technologies. So kind of outside the scope of what we were talking about, but I wanted a chance to highlight it because I think we've received a lot of interest and others are excited, and Deerfield's had success with this model in the past as well.
This is great, and indeed an example of investors going earlier in a very bold from Deerfield, and a good contribution to the ecosystem for sure. So back to you, Ryan. What are you seeing?
So for us, as I mentioned, we like to participate in seed financing that's for grantees that are starting new ventures. When we do that, we look to partner though with other. We typically don't do that on our own, right? We look for another investor. So we partner. We speak with lots of different venture capital groups, studios, firms who are also interested in doing the same, and we view that as we view those partnerships as really fundamental to any investing activity that we're going to do. And in fact, we want someone to take the lead on it. We'll be catalytic. We'll be the first person to make a commitment, possibly, right? And we'll vet the scientific side too, so that there's some credibility coming out of it from there. But then we really look to another, investor, whether it's a venture or institutional, that can bring a different, that can bring a different set of resources and a different kind of a scale of infrastructure. So those partnerships to us are fundamental, and I think all the investing we do is through those. I mean, it's every year is different, and over the recent years, I think, as Anton was nicely describing the current environment, there's a lot of new players and additional access to the capital. We really do try to focus on people who are really looking at the same, investing on kind of more traditional, I guess, principles in the life science venture space, that are really looking at, ways to generate value, scientific value for patients, and because that's fundamentally what our mission's about in the end, is the value for patients. So we look for partners that share that.
Yeah, thank you. So Meredith, maybe I can ask you to complement this, maybe with focus on BD deals that the fledgling companies are doing, or maybe you're even doing earlier still in the academic setting. So whether it's pharma or other types of BD business development deals.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I'll pick up actually a little bit on something that I believe Kate mentioned earlier. Forgive me if I'm attributing it to the wrong person, but I think around BD, our investment thesis has continued to remain the same, that the opportunity to do transformative deals for early stage companies in the oncology space has remained there, right? That unlike other investments where I may feel that I need to hold this through clinical proof of concept before I'm going to see an inflection point or a transaction opportunity, we're still seeing partnering deals getting done early in the oncology space. Where I think it's becoming more challenging for those companies is, what is that differentiating data package that you need to actually generate in order to attract that? We've seen a lot of folks sort of trying to do everything that they doesn't matter what the asset is, combo with the PD-1 and see what happens. And I don't mean to sound dismissive of that at all, because I think there are actually some terrific reasonings behind that, but it has sort of seemed to be in vogue. And so it's an interesting dynamic, and that I think we still feel that the partnering opportunities are there, both for companies, big pharma, who already have sort of an anchor in IO and want to look for those combinations, or ones who may not, who have decided they're going to sort of skip over the checkpoint and look for what's next. But again, it is really building that differentiating piece that you have to do. And we're not seeing those happen overnight the way that we did before. So you actually have to build that data package and convince the pharmas with data and not promise, which is, I think, part of the way that we're thinking about the maturation of this field, as we're just understanding responders, non-responders, the upside of what we have out there that's approved, and gaps that still need to be filled.
Thank you, Meredith. How about you, Althea?
No, I completely agree. I think that we now have more tools in the toolbox. And so now it's about how do we either enhance the current tools that are being used and make them more efficacious, or, you know, what else can you add to the mix, and have a more refined approach. So we do struggle with that with our portfolio companies around trying to understand better what data packages you really need to build out, because there is a definite call for substance behind it. But what's nice is I haven't seen the retraction from industry around trying to partner with academic institutions. They're still willing to go early, which has been a nice revolution, I would say, in the last decade. So I think that having that demand still there is really helping spur on innovation.
Yeah, that's great. Well, I think we're almost at time. Any final comments from you, Kuldeep, to wrap this up? I wish we could go on forever. There's a lot more to come.
No, there's more discussion points, Michal, than time to discuss it. I do want to thank the panel for a very interesting discussion. Again, to me personally, the hot areas and the challenges, right, of dealing with data and what patient stratification means in the area of, the space of immuno-oncology, not to mention, what really is the next generation NK CAR that perhaps is going to be the therapy or not. These are opportunities, but with a lot of challenges. I do want to thank everyone for participating in the panel. Anything else from you, Michal, and others?
I'll just add some optimism. I think that we heard many encouraging, a lot of encouraging information in terms of additional solutions that are coming, capital that is flowing, and there are always challenges. But I think that the ecosystem for biotech immuno-oncology is probably stronger than ever coming out of COVID, with a lot of learning from this period, more collaboration, more information sharing generally in the field, which may also empower the acceleration and the productivity of pipelines for patients in this field. So good reason to be optimistic, and looking forward to next year's panel, in which we will talk about all of the amazing things that we achieved this year. So thank you. Thanks also for the organizers for inviting us all, and thanks for the very, very wonderful and informative and insightful comments from all of you.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.